My name is Dan Stair of Daniel's Training Services, and I provide training and consulting services on the management of waste and on the transportation of hazardous materials. There's going to be a link to my website at the end of this video, and if you have any questions about anything I've talked about here today, please feel free to contact me. The purpose of this video here today is I want to talk just about identifying and explaining the limited quantity exception to the USDOT Hazardous Materials Regulations. So we're going to go into more detail about all of that. First off, what is a hazardous material? A hazardous material is something that the USDOT has determined that is capable of posing an unreasonable risk when it's transported by or for a business. That's what they mean by transported in commerce. So these regulations don't apply to you in your private day-to-day activities. There is also an exemption for government employees, but if you're a business or it's being transported by or for a business and it's something DOT thinks could pose an unreasonable risk and it's an article or a substance, then it will probably be regulated as a hazardous material per the USDOT regulations, and therefore there's going to be regulations that will apply to its packaging and its labeling and its marking and shipping papers and placards for the vehicle and training for HazMat employees and fees and registration. All that kind of stuff apply to the transportation in commerce of a hazardous material. Now, with all those regulations, DOT has created exceptions. So there are exceptions to those full regulations. And if you can take advantage of those exceptions, that can be a significant cost savings for your business. So what we're going to do here in this short video, again, is just to identify and explain only one of those packaging exceptions, and it's the limited quantity exception. There are others, but this one is probably one of the most common that are out there. So, what is the limited quantity exception? First off, it's a packaging exception, meaning that whether or not you can take advantage of the exception and how you comply with the regulations are based on the type and the size of the packaging and the amount of hazardous material that's present. Because again, remember, this is a hazardous material. You're merely finding an exception from the full regulation. So first off, it starts out, we've got a hazardous material, then we look at to see if the limited quantity exception will apply. So this packaging exception is available for many different kinds of hazmat. That's what makes it really useful. From aerosols to corrosive liquids, fire extinguishers, antifreeze, flammable liquids, all sorts of different hazardous materials can be shipped according to the limited quantity exception. How you find out if the limited quantity exception is applicable to your hazmat is you got to go to the hazardous materials table. So in the federal regulations, 49 CFR 172.101, there is the hazardous materials table. And in that table, in column 8A of the hazardous materials table, as you go scroll down that column for your hazardous material, there will either be a number there or the word none. Now, if the word none is there, then you can't ship it as a limited quantity. But if there's a number there, then that tells you that you can ship it as a limited quantity, and also that number tells you where to go in the federal regulations to find out more about shipping it as a limited quantity. So we're going to come back to that particular citation in just a little bit. So it all starts in column 8A of the hazardous materials table. You got to go there first to see if you can even ship it as a limited quantity. Now, when you determine that you can ship it as a limited quantity, then the limitations of the exception are based on the type of hazmat and the packing group. Okay, those two things. So depending on how dangerous your hazardous material is, there's going to be limits on the inner net capacity of the inner receptacle. So in this packaging, there would be one or more inner receptacles. And the regulations for a limited quantity will set a limit on the maximum size of that inner receptacle. It might be a gallon, it might be a quart, it might be a pint. It could be very low. And of course there are metric measurements as well. So there will be limits on how big the net capacity of the inner receptacle can be. There is also, for all limited quantities, a maximum gross package weight of 30 kilograms, which is about 66 pounds. So you have a gross package weight when this is all done, and the hazmat's in there, and the packaging, and the tape, and the absorbent, and whatever else you might use. When it's all done, it can't weigh more than 30 kilograms. That particular gross package weight applies to all hazardous materials shipped as a limited quantity. So none of these can weigh more than 30 kilograms. What's going to differ then is the size of the inner receptacles in that packaging. Now, how do you know what size, what is the maximum net capacity of your inner receptacles? Well, you get that from the Hazardous Materials Regulations as well. So if we go back a little bit, you remember I mentioned column 8A of the Hazardous Materials table, and there'll be a number there. Well, that number refers you to, ready for this, 49 CFR 173, part 173, point, and then whatever number you have in column 8A. So you take that number that you see in column 8A, you go to part 173 of Title 49, look up that section, and that will have all your information for your shipping of that hazardous material as a limited quantity, including the maximum net capacity of your inner receptacles and other things that I'm going to talk about here. So that seems like a lot. It's really not too hard once you get the hang of it. The question then would be, well, why would I ship something as a limited quantity? Well, because you get an exception from a good chunk of the regulation. So for example, you're shipping as a limited quantity, the packaging does not have to be DOT specification packaging. All that's required is a combination packaging with a strong outer packaging, and that's it. So combination packaging means that you've got inner receptacles. That's it, inner receptacles that are inside and outer packaging. And as long as your outer packaging is a strong outer packaging, that's sufficient. So a simple cardboard box, it doesn't meet the specifications. It doesn't have to be made to any specific standards. Just a good, sturdy cardboard box will suffice as your packaging. You can save a lot of money on your packaging costs. Also, you may notice there are no HazMat labels. So HazMat labels are not required unless it's going to be shipped by air. Also, you don't need a shipping paper. So no bill of lading or anything like that is required unless it's a hazardous substance or a hazardous waste or a marine pollutant, or it's going to be transported by air or by vessel. But if it's not one of those things, then no shipping paper is required for your shipment. That can be a big relief. Also, there are no placards required on the motor vehicle. So no matter how much of this limited quantity I might have, I'm not required to placard the vehicle, and that has all sorts of impacts on other regulations. So if you can avoid shipping your hazmat in a way that requires placarding, you can save money on all sorts of different things, and we're not even going to get into that here, but there are other downstream impacts to shipping your hazardous material in a quantity that requires placarding. The limited quantity exception does not. Also, you don't need any markings on the package, except for two things. There's two different markings that are required. One is this right here, that black diamond tipped marking there that may actually look like a label, but it's not. That is not a hazmat label. That is a marking, and that is required to identify a limited quantity. So you're required to have that on one side of the package, and that's all that's required. So that limited quantity marking right there. That's the only marking you need. And the other marking you need is orientation arrows on two opposing sides. You can see that. So if your limited quantity has inner liquid packagings, if there's liquids in here, then you have to have, in addition to the limited quantity marking, you have to have the orientation arrows on two opposing sides of the package. Now, you can see here with these, just this small variety of packages that I have, there are some things that people do differently and don't need to do. Like, for example, these are aerosol cans shipped as a limited quantity. Aerosol cans don't need the orientation arrows because they don't meet the definition of inner liquid packagings. But look, they put orientation arrows on all four sides just to be sure. So that's an unnecessary expense. They don't have to do that. Here we see a fire extinguisher that was shipped as a limited quantity, and this does not have the orientation arrows, and they're not required for this one. So people have their own ways of doing things. You need to comply with the regulations, though. That's what's important. So with all of these different limited quantity exceptions and the things that I mentioned, you might wonder, well, why would I take advantage of this? Why would this matter to me? For most hazardous materials that are shipped by highway or rail in small enough quantities, there will be no shipping papers, no HazMat labels, no placards on the truck, very few package marking requirements, and the big one, you don't need specification packaging. So you could save yourself a lot of money on your packaging costs by shipping as a limited quantity. Now, one thing that does still apply is you still need HazMat employee training. Why? Because these are still hazardous materials. They're still subject to the regulations. You're merely taking advantage of an exception, but you still need to provide HazMat employee training every 3 years for anyone involved in the transportation of these hazardous materials. And if I haven't mentioned it, that's one of the things that I do. I provide HazMat employee training. So if you ever have any questions about the limited quantity exception or other exceptions to the hazardous materials regulations, or if you have a question about the training requirements of the USDOT, please don't hesitate to give me a call. Thank you very much.